Hello, and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Russia ties to the West seem to be stronger than one could assume. After the first shock of the sanctions in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kremlin has managed to get back to control over Western business interests in Moscow. Many world companies which have first announced that they leave Russian market are back to Russia. And other companies who say they do not sell goods to Russia increase their exports to Russia's direct neighbors like Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan by 20 or even 30 times. How did Moscow regime manage to create such network of connection and reach such influence? And what our Western businesses' interests are in Russia? To answer these questions, we have invited Charles Hecker, who is a risk analyst expert. He spent 40 years traveling through the Soviet Union and Russia, worked as a journalist at the Miami Herald and the Moscow Times, and he was a geopolitical risk consultant at Control Risks, where he also was a partner in the firm. And what is the most important now for this conversation, he is an author of his new book, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, which comes in November, available for pre-order at Amazon. Welcome, Charles.
Sergej, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. And let me address this question, which I've already partly described. How did Russia manage to control Western business interests? And can we say that Kremlin, to a certain extent, controls Western businesses?
Well, if we're talking about what's happening now, and if we're talking about what's been happening since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin is exerting an enormous amount of control over Western businesses, particularly the Western businesses that want to leave Russia but have not left Russia yet. And there's lots of different ways to talk about the companies that are still in Russia now, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what's happening now is the Kremlin, through a government commission, has set the terms and conditions for companies that want to leave Russia. And the terms and conditions are incredibly punishing. If a company wants to exit the Russian market fully, and let's say sell its business in Russia, the Russian government says that, first of all, you will only be able to sell your company for 50% of its value. And the value of the company that wants to leave Russia is being determined by a list of state-appointed auditors. So that's number one. Number two, when you leave the country, and if you sell the business, then the company has to give 15% of the transaction to the Russian government. So together, these are two major haircuts on international businesses that want to leave the country. And that's only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is finding a buyer. And so when a company announces that it wants to leave Russia and wants to sell up and get out, you have a potential list of buyers that comes together. And this list of buyers can be genuinely quite problematic. Some of them may be sanctioned individuals. Some of them may have questionable reputations. Some of them will be very close politically to the Kremlin. And from the Kremlin's perspective, that's sort of the idea. And that makes things very, very difficult for the Western seller. Because if any of these potential buyers, for example, are sanctioned, then the Western company can't transact, even if it's just to leave Russia. And the process has been described to me as somebody who participated in this process as really this group of vultures that are trying to extract as much value as possible from Western companies as they leave. And what's happening really is this fantastic transfer of value and transfer of wealth from Western company owners to Russian company owners. The process is lengthy, The process is painful. The process is political. And it's damaging ultimately to the international companies that are exiting.
But this is what you describe in now, like this is what happening now. But to get such to get into such vulnerable position when you just cannot leave the country, you first had to come to this country and have done all these investments, and this is practically the sunk cost fallacy, if we look from the general perspective. So your book describes how Western companies in early 1990s and later invested their money in Russia in a hope that this is a good idea and they will be rewarded for this. So how did it come to the situation when they stuck in this swamp so deep that they cannot save their investments?
So that's the main question and the main principle of the book. And that is, what is the assumptions that Western businesses or international businesses were making when they invested in Russia in the first place, and whether those assumptions held up or remained valid as the Russian market evolved, and then as Russia as a political and economic entity, as a state, evolved from the 1990s to the 2000s to where we are today. And so, if you cast your mind back, I mean, the very, very first real entry of international business in a big way in Russia was the 1987 joint venture law in the Soviet Union. And this brought a lot of companies to the bargaining table with the Soviet Ministry of Trade, and created, at least on paper, quite a lot of joint ventures. Very few of them at the end of the day were successful. But what we knew and what international companies understood towards the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 1990s, particularly at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of Russia as a new country and as a new market, what the international business community knew then was that this was a country that was absolutely starved for investment. It was starved for investment in heavy industry. It was starved for investment in a number of sectors that practically didn't even exist in the Soviet Union, but were now opening for business in Russia. And the other thing that companies understood about the early days of the Russian Federation was that Russian consumers had millions, maybe even billions of rubles stuffed under their mattresses, waiting to be spent on foreign products. And everything from German washing machines to French shampoo and everything in between. And so companies absolutely just poured into Russia. The flights to Moscow were packed with people going into Russia and looking for opportunity. And it was big companies and it was small companies and it was individuals and it was the US and the European Union and Japan, the G7, most of the countries of the G20 were absolutely marching into Russia in anticipation of a major new market. And remember, Sergej, that this was at the time of globalization, when everyone, all kinds of businesses all around the world, were going to markets that they had never thought of before. You know, this is the time when people were thinking about Brazil, they were thinking about India, they were thinking about China, they were thinking about Vietnam, they were thinking about lots of countries around the world that previously seemed too risky or too far away or too dangerous. Globalization changed all of that. And Russia sat very, very much at the middle of this trend. And a lot of companies were thinking, okay, Russia may be new and different and risky and unfamiliar, but the philosophy at the time was it was irresponsible not to go to Russia. You could not overlook this country as a place of investment in the overall context of globalization. And so we just had this absolute stampede of businesses into Russia.
And I can imagine that from that perspective of end of 1980s, early 1990s, when you really like could buy a lot of property in Russia for very small money, the idea was predominant in the heads of Western companies. We are so strong. There is no risk at all. The investment is so low, and we have so much leverage, and Moscow is so much in need of our money that there is no risk. We will come in and we will just dominate the market, and we will expand our presence. And also, I remember that the Western governments, they also used private companies in 1980s, even for political deals. Just remember how PepsiCo has turned for a short amount of time the largest owner of naval vessels in the world, one of the largest navies in the world, because just the Soviet Union just had, in agreement with the U.S. government, just scrapped their naval vessels into the possession of PepsiCo, so they could have been transferred to naval yards. So they had this idea: we are so strong, the Russians would not be able to do nothing bad to us.
So the risk equation and the risk calculation was incredibly complicated in the early days. And you're absolutely right. Pepsi um, undertook an unusual transaction as part of its expansion on the Russian market, because of course back in those days the ruble was non-convertible, and this is still in the Soviet period. And Pepsi took. You're absolutely right. They took naval vessels in exchange for Pepsi syrup that they exported onto the market. And you're right. For a while, that gave Pepsi a rather sizable navy until they got rid of those ships in a transaction with another company. But the risk equation in Russia in the 1990s was incredibly complicated because remember, Sergey, this was a time of enormous political instability in Russia. You had President Yeltsin and a very, very messy multi-party proto democracy, I would say, where the Communist Party was still a significant political force and a significant threat to democratization. And really, politics in Russia in the 1990s was this sort of street level bazaar of different voices and different organizations and different parties. You also had in the 1990s an absolute explosion in organized crime in Russia. And there was sort of overlapping circles of criminality and politics and business. So the risks were there for international investors in Russia. And there was no way that you didn't know about this. This was on the front page of newspapers all the time because the level of criminality was quite prominent in the 1990s. This is when cars were being blown up on the streets and people were being murdered in broad daylight. And Yeltsin, as a political figure, it was very hard to avoid the fact that he himself was unstable. He was unstable as an individual. His health was unstable. His behavior was unstable, and he was the subject of all of these moments when we knew that he wasn't in control, and there were times when he had a bit too much to drink in public, and everyone knew about this. But here's what was happening, Sergey, and this is what's really important about the risk picture and what Western companies were thinking when they went in. The first thing is that governments all over the world were saying Russia is an emerging democracy. So go invest in Russia. Help make Russia safe by doing business there. And that your presence in Russia will help the transition to democracy. And companies were thinking every time there was a new Snickers billboard in Moscow, companies were thinking, aha, we're moving in the right direction.
And from another perspective, from the point of view of Russian ultranationalists and these communists and former military circles, that was the visible sign of Russia's failure and subversion by the West. I remember all these gigantic paintings by Ilya Glazunov, an ultranationalist painter, one of the creator of this current Russian nationalist mythos, and he deliberately used this advertising of Pall Mall, of Pepsi, of Coca-Cola, of Snickers in his paintings as a symbolic mean to describe how the West destroyed the Russian soul.
That's right. Remember that in the early days, the Russian economy collapsed completely. And Russia went through a period of a number of years of hyperinflation where the ruble was crashing. Russian salaries became worthless. And it was difficult in general in some of the bigger cities, and certainly out in the Russian countryside, it was difficult to put food on the table. And this was Russia's earliest experiment, you could say, with capitalism. And we had the shock therapy of the early 1990s. And this was an extremely bitter experience for most Russians outside sort of certain Moscow business circles. And so Russia's initial understanding of what was capitalism was extremely painful. And I think that those memories in certain circles linger to this day. Now, we were also told, though, and I say we, I think of the international business community, we were told that Russia was an emerging market economy. And so we were getting these sort of green light signals from the United States, from the European Union, from governments around the world saying, this is a good place to invest. And so the risk equation was a little bit distorted. And I think that international investors came to Russia, and to a certain degree, they saw what was there. It was impossible to avoid. But to another degree, I think they also a little bit saw what they wanted to see. And then I also think that they had the words of their governments in the back of their minds saying, this is the place to go. Bear in mind, finally, that shareholders and stakeholders and all of the people that are involved in the community of a business were also saying, go to Russia. This is, the new market. And so a company that said, sorry, we're not interested in Russia, that just wasn't an option.
Absolutely. And I can imagine how much the shareholders demanded the company just to demonstrate that they have opened their business representation in Russia. But what I wanted to ask you, Charles, are as we know that now Russia is taking controls over all these businesses directly or indirectly, or at least bringing them to submission, how much did these Western investors cooperate with the future Russian FSB leaders? And was it necessary back then, like to have like a smart guy from the former KGB who knows the things, who can protect your business, who knows the people in the government, who can introduce you? And is it the case that the Western investment helped this FSB clique to grow up and to be powerful?
So there are a few answers to that question. That's a great question and a big question, and a few different ways of looking at this. So we can start with the relationship between business and the government. And you're absolutely right to say that when you talk about the government, you have to talk about the security services, because in Russia, you can't have one without the other. So the book, I interviewed more than 75 executives and government officials and academics and analysts and all kinds of people who were involved in Russia on the ground from the late 80s till today. And opinion was a little bit split on the business involvement with the government and the sort of the security environment. There was a strand of thinking in Russia that you cannot get a big deal done without government approval and government permission. And of course, that would involve a certain level of sign-off from the security services. And what happened in sort of the mid-2000s was that the Russian government defined a series of strategic sectors where foreign investment would be very tightly controlled, very tightly restricted, and when there was a ceiling of 25% of foreign investment in any industry that the Russian government decided was a strategic sector. And it was a fairly long list. It was everything from including the fishing industry to the media industry, and of course, anything defense related, anything energy related. And I think companies understood that to invest in those sectors, they had to be extremely careful, and they had to consider strategic political interests from Russia very carefully. And that was the signal, or one of the signals, that came out of the nationalization of Yukos. And that was a message from the Kremlin to the owner of Yukos, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and to anybody else interested in the oil business in Russia, including BP, that government interests in this sector are number one, and private interests in this sector are number two, at best.
I have two questions resulting from this, and if you allow me, Charles. First one is, was it not from the beginning the inevitable situation, like who had experience of international transactions and dealing with international companies in the Soviet Union? These were like KGB people who were planted to Soviet embassies as trade attaches, as representatives of Russian companies. Of course, they were all like KGB trained at least, and they knew what is international contract. They knew what is the deal. And if you wanted to sign an agreement on joint venture in 1990s or later, of course you will land at the table sitting in front of a former KGB officer. But did Western governments understand how much influence they give Russia by letting their companies go to this market and being dictated by these quasi legislative rules developed by the former KGB officers?
So, two things on that. First of all, you're absolutely right that there was a very, very tiny number of individuals in Russia in the 1990s who understood anything about the West and who understood anything about market economics. A very, very small number of people. And a great number of those people came from the security services. Because just as you pointed out, these were the individuals who were allowed to travel, who maybe lived in the West inside embassies, and who had contact with foreigners. It's really hard for us to remember. You have to cast your mind really far back now to remind ourselves just how incredibly isolated and how cut off the Soviet Union was from the rest of the world. And the only people who could penetrate the rest of the world were high ranking members of the security services. And there's a few pages in the book include an interview with a businessman who went to Moscow in the very early days. I think it was 1992. So this is the very early days and months of the Russian Federation. And he wanted to do a joint venture. And it was suggested to him that he should be doing a joint venture with this group of individuals. And it turns out, of course, that all of these people were from the KGB. And they really were not very good joint venture partners at the end of the day. They didn't have a very good understanding about how an international business worked. And according to this interview with the Western individual, they didn't really understand what it was like to work very hard either. And so you're right to say that. From the perspective of Western governments, I think there was a slightly, maybe even not so slightly, naive assumption that we could change a country through investment. And of course, particularly for the United States, and in the after the end of the Cold War, the sort of Cold War hangover was extremely prominent. And I think with American companies and with the American government, I think the Cold War hangover exists to this day. It's of course been recharged by the war in Ukraine. But in the early days, whether it was the United States or the European Union or Japan or other countries, there was an assumption that by going into Russia, in spite of the fact that it had, a global security service that was feared around the world, um, governments told us that by investing in Russia, we might be able to make the country change. And Sergey, just to finish this point briefly, the United States at least made this assumption many years later with China. And there are people in the book who talk about what the US called convergence theory. And the idea was that by investing in China, we would gradually, over a period of years, help the Chinese economy converge with the American economy and not come together and become one, but become extremely similar. And of course, we've seen that that's not the case either.
That resonates in my heart totally because, as I'm a German citizen, we had in our German government this concept of Wandel durch Handel, or a change through trade. And the idea was the same, that countries which have intensive trade, they don't go into war, or they understand the mutual dependency. And practically, this concept has worked, but not as intended. The change has indeed happened, but on the wrong side. It's not Russia which turned to be a bigger democracy. It is Germany which turned to be more dependent on Russia and more reluctant on fighting Russia back. What you have mentioned with China is extremely important, I think, as we are facing now this discussion in many countries in Europe, but also in the US, what to do with the dependency from China. If the Russian market, we could have cut our businesses in Germany, for example, from Russia, and it was painful, but it was possible. But we didn't produce anything in Russia which we used to export outside of Russia. So we could cut this. But in China, it's quite different. We produce things in China which we export to other countries and even to our own market.
So we've learned a couple of very important lessons with the collapse of the Russian market and the emergence of the Chinese market. And I think we've learned over the years a few things. The first one is that there are a lot of markets, a lot of capitalist economies, a lot of places to do business that have governments that do not share our values as Western investors. And so you can be a capitalist economy without having a democratic government. And I think that that's an important lesson for business and for businesses to continue to invest globally and to have the same footprint that they have now. They will have to come to some sort of internal and external understanding that certain markets may be very appealing to them, but the governments may not be. And that's something that presents a certain risk profile that is a significant challenge for companies to manage and to govern. And specifically on the topic of China and our economic dependence or interdependence on China, we were also told, go invest in China. And China was also one of the biggest drivers of the globalization story. And now that China is deeply, deeply integrated into the global economy, we understand that that level of integration from a security perspective drives a certain level of risk. And you have the United States government telling its companies, well, we need to de-risk, or we need to decouple, or we need to restructure our supply chains and remove the risk that investment in China represents. The problem with that is that that's very expensive to do. And from a business perspective is extremely costly. And, I'm reminded of what we went through here in the UK not too long ago with Brexit, where the popular expression was, when you try to extract the United Kingdom from the European Union, people were saying, well, you can't take the egg out of an omelet. And imagine that multiplied, exponentially with China and the level of integration um, between East and West economically. Remember, Sergey, how painful it was on energy markets after the start of the full-scale invasion. And remember how painful it was on global commodity markets, including grain and wheat and cereals and the main exports from Ukraine and the main exports from Russia in the immediate aftermath of the full-scale invasion. Imagine if geopolitical tensions with China were to reach that kind of peak. Imagine the disruption that we'd see unleashed on global markets.
Can we say that, well, talking about Russia and China, both authoritarian regimes and maybe dictatorships, I would personally say dictatorships, when they are dealing with our companies, which are coming from the free world, that they have like a much broader palette of tools dealing with them. Like in our countries and democracies, we cannot dictate to the countries what to do. But in these countries, the government can, and they have a huge influence of intelligence services. Can we say that there was like a sort of a broader palette of tools which Moscow or Beijing imposed on the Western businessmen, trying to influence them to open these businesses, to ignore risks, to maybe even to lie to their headquarters?
Well, I think there were. I think the primary. I mean, it's clear. You're absolutely right to say that the level of government involvement in the Russian economy and in the Chinese economy is qualitatively different than the type of involvement of a Western democratic sort of market economy. That level of government involvement. The main challenge to Western or international companies doing business in Russia and in China was just how difficult it was to understand what the government's priorities and the government's tools and mechanisms were. The opacity of the Russian government, the opacity of what made the Chinese or what makes the Chinese government work and what makes it tick. These were the main challenges to investors in those countries. It was extremely difficult to understand and interpret and anticipate, let alone react, but to anticipate what was going on. Remember, in a country, of the size of China and the complexity and the population, the size of its economy, what's going on the city level, on the regional level, on the national level, what's going on in the government, what's going on in the party, what's going on with regulators, what's going on with your Chinese competitors, what's going on with your Western competitors in China. The picture there, and forgive me for this, I'm not a China expert, but uh, the main challenge, I think, aside from operational challenges, logistical challenges, and the sort of day-to-day work that everyone does in every market, the additional level of risk, the additional level of difficulty in places like Russia or places like China was that we didn't have a very good concept of what the government was thinking at any moment. And moreover, it was difficult to anticipate when government thinking would change and how it would change.
Can we say that now, when we come back to Russia and this dilemma of imposing sanctions on Russia, but having, as our government say, almost no tools, as we in the EU do not have secondary sanctions, we cannot just say don't sell goods to Kyrgyzstan or to Kazakhstan, even when you know that these goods may go further to Russia. So we cannot practically prohibit this by the existing legal means. It doesn't mean that these means cannot be created. They can, but they are not being created by our legislators. Can we say that now, in this geopolitical game of power, Russia has an upper hand and can practically dictate the businesses what to do, and our governments cannot stop this. It's exactly what you said before. You cannot just leave Russian market. And if you do not have like any moral restraints, you don't think about if it's good or bad, it brings you some profit, you just continue to do it, because who can forbid you from doing that?
Well, precisely. I mean, first of all, in response to the comment that you just made, there are companies who have openly said, and this is in the media and everywhere, there are companies that openly said that they do not feel any moral restrictions about doing business in Russia, and they're there to do business, and everything else is secondary. Number one. Number two, the situation with sanctions has been extremely frustrating, I would say. And so we've seen two things. We've seen how incredibly resilient the Russian economy has been in devising workarounds, in avoiding Western and international sanctions. And that is that, as you absolutely correctly point out, and that is the importation of goods through third countries, or sourcing of goods from alternative providers that are not under sanctions, but by and large, really violating the law of sanctions and also the spirit of sanctions. And Russia has been extremely clever in working its way around the sanctions regimes that have been on it. Russia is now more sanctioned than any other country in the world. It's more sanctioned than North Korea. It's more sanctioned than Iran. But I think the Soviet experience, interestingly enough, the Soviet experience has given the Russian economy and the Russian government the mechanisms, the genetic memory, if you will, in beating sanctions and developing workarounds. Um, it's sanctions are a long game, and I think that sanctions will slowly but surely cause increasing levels of pain on the Russian economy. It is already, it's expensive and it's time consuming, and it is painful to a certain degree to think up all of these workarounds and to do business as indirectly as sanctions force you to do. It has, however, been frustrating, I think, to see how long it's taken for sanctions to deliver the impact that we thought they would deliver much, much more quickly.
And if we can compare how businesses from different countries deal with Russia, can we say that there are different patterns, or are they more or less the same?
Yeah, I mean, countries that are not under sanctions or applying sanctions are doing business with Russia without any difficulty. And we've seen countries like China and India, among the bigger economies, doing robust trade with Russia in energy and also in supplying components and inputs into the economy from their own companies that are not subject to sanctions. And that is a type of workaround that will be very difficult for the United States to control, or for the UK or for the EU, in terms of their sanctions regimes. And you're right to suggest that Russia has begun to reorient its economy away from Europe and towards Asia. And the other thing, Sergey, that I think is important here is that this economic reorientation, the fact that Russia can reorient its economy towards other countries, shows us that a lot of other countries around the world don't really see the war in Ukraine as their issue or as their problem, and that they are perfectly content to carry on diplomatic and economic relations with Russia, and the war in Ukraine belongs to somebody else.
And that is, of course, what many companies, even in Germany, are saying, that like selling some food like chocolate to Russia has nothing to do with the war. They just want to give the Russian kids the same joy that the German kids have, like opening a bar of German chocolate, which saying, of course, sounds horrible if you listen to it while being under Russian shelling in Kharkiv or in Zaporizhia or in Kiev. That is the attitude which our governments helped to arise when even our government could not sanction Russia completely. For example, cutting it off from the banking system, or completely banning import of Russian energy, fossil energy sources. We know that the European Union still continues by Russia's LNG and other Russian goods. But we can talk about this for hours, I'm afraid. And what is very interesting from your description is to see how gradually this dependency grew up, and now the result where we land now came from many different steps, from some hopes, some aspirations, some mistakes, some successful steps, but after all, the whole development was disastrous. Do we have any way out of this?
So, I was thinking, while you were talking about the German business community and its wishes for a perfect business world where it could sell German chocolate to anywhere it wanted to, and what that means, for the future. And in a perfect world, Sergey, maybe from a business perspective, in a perfect world, business and politics would travel on separate tracks. But the problem is that life is not that simple, and that sometimes politics is business and sometimes business is politics. And it's very, very difficult for the two to travel on separate tracks, particularly at times of crisis, at times of conflict. And, you know, I think that this situation is inevitable, and I think that it will continue to be this way, whether it's Russia or China or whatever comes next, in crisis and maybe even not in crisis. Bearing in mind, though, that we live in a geopolitical period where disruption is almost nonstop, uh, and so business becomes political. Nord Stream 2. Was Nord Stream 2 a business project or was it a political project? Um, it was a geopolitical project, no matter how you slice it. And gestures like that, Nord Stream 2 was massive, and a major cross-border strategic initiative. So at that level, naturally, but even below that level, um, business and politics will always travel on very, very close tracks. And sometimes those tracks are going to crash. And I think the challenge going forward is to understand, where the pinch points are in the relationship between business and politics. And I think that we thought something might go better in Russia, and it didn't. And you'll remember maybe the famous expression from Victor Chernomyrdin: "Хотелось как лучше, но получилось как всегда." We hoped for the best, but it turned out like always. Um, I think that we kind of have to be careful about what we hope for and be a little bit more realistic in the way we think things are going to turn out.
That is a very good thing, which we need to always think about what will be the result of our actions and how can we be sure that our hopes will really turn real and not in some different way, which we will not be happy to see. This was an interview with Charles Hecker, who is a risk analyst expert and an author of a book, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, which comes in November, already available for pre-order on Amazon. And before, Charles spent 40 years traveling through the Soviet Union and Russia, worked as a journalist at the Miami Herald and the Moscow Times, and was a geopolitical risk consultant at Control Risks. Thank you so much for your time, Charles.
Sergey, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this.